12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is the day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your division out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some on the top and on the both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning, when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians. He will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.' Then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, lead my people, you and the Israelites, go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "We will all die." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward them, the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "These are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it. Any slave you have brought may eat it, and you have bought may eat it, after you have circumcised him. But a temporary resident or a hired worker may not eat it. It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you." All the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. May the Lord bless the reading of His word. God, my mouth, I speak the message that I have prepared, that it be His message, not my message. That His will I've done, not mine. That He might receive glory and honor, not I. And all those with ears might hear the words of the Lord. Amen. Amen. My sermon this morning is entitled, YOLO. You only leave once. For this scripture is the text that tells us, the passage that tells us not only what happened, but how it's to be remembered. You have both the Passover feast and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You get both of those here, and you also get what happened. You get this narrative piece. And you also get some, little insight into what's going to happen later on when they enter into the land and their children ask about it, and also how you're supposed to incorporate foreigners and other people and things. It's this fascinating text because the voice changes in it. Did you notice? Sometimes it's laying out, okay, this is what you're supposed to do for this, and then and by the way, this is what happened, and here's Pharaoh, and then he's not there. It shows some signs of what scholars would say, some editing, some theological editing, some pieces of different traditions that have been put together. Now, there's a little bit of a debate about what when that happens and who's doing it, but it's pretty clear that we see these different things being put together to make certain points. to make certain emphases. And so we read it, and whether or not we read it as, oh, yeah, Moses is the editor, which is one of the possibilities, and folks who are most traditional and want to say that, these are the books of Moses and Moses wrote them, then you can see that Moses' hand is doing it, or maybe you want to go for Joshua or Ezra or Hezekiah or some unnamed priest later on taking this oral tradition and putting it together. We don't exactly know. We aren't certain that we have the text that Moses had or that Joshua had or something, but we do know that we have the text that Jesus had. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that this is the text. This is the form. These are the words that the Jewish people have 70 years BC, 70 BC or 68. We know this is the text that Jesus had. We know that this is the text that Paul had when he says all Scripture is God-breathed. And so whoever it is who does the editing, whoever it is who puts all these things together and juxtaposes this, this instruction with this narrative, whoever does all of that, we want to know what it is. Because if it's good enough for Jesus to be reading and preaching from, well then, by golly, it's good enough for us. Right? And so, sometimes we can get excited about all those some of us get excited about all the academic sort of hypotheses and theories and this piece dating to this thing. We read this as a whole because Jesus preached from it as a whole. And Jesus says, these are the things that tell of Him. And so, as followers of Jesus, as people who have encountered the risen Christ, we want to read it and understand it as Jesus preached from it and as Jesus understood it. So we read this text and we want to look at the ways that it's put together, this juxtaposition of ideas, the contrast of these concepts that we see in here, in order to more fully understand what God is communicating in this text, and to understand how it reveals something to us today about how we're to live our lives. So let's dig into it. One of the things that we see in this text, in this story, one of the concepts is this tension between provision and waste. Did you notice at the very beginning, in verse 4? Right, so God's telling the Israelites that He's going to deliver them. One of the things that makes it a little bit strange is it's as if it was as if the leaders of Bunker Hill, before the British are there and they're fighting. Who was it? Ethan Allen I should move a little bit closer. Was it Ethan Allen at Battle of Bennington? Right, help me out, you Vermonters. Yeah. Okay. So it'd be a little bit like Ethan Allen being there at the Battle of Bennington, preparing the fight. And mentioning, oh, by the way, this is always going to be a holiday that you're always going to have to celebrate. You're not going to be able to register your car 100 years from now. This is the way that you shall remember this. They didn't know how it was going to end up, right? When these historical things that we remember, they didn't, when the 4th of July, we didn't know it was going to be a big thing until after we had beaten the British, right? So one of the things that's a little bit weird reading this is, if this is how God gave it to Moses straight up, before they leave Egypt, it's a little bit weird for God. Now, God knows everything. It could be, prophecy. But it's a little bit weird for Him to be, by the way, this is going to be one of these holidays that you're going to have to remember forever. It makes a little bit of sense after it's happened, and God says, oh, remember this? You're always going to want to remember this. Anyway. So God is telling the people that this is how He's going to deliver them. This is how He's going to bring them out of Egypt after 430 years of captivity. You may feel like your life is stuck in a rut. You may feel like there's a lot of problems, a lot of things weighing on you, and you're never going to get out of it. 430 years is a long time to be in slavery. After 430 years, God says, listen, I'm going to deliver you, and this is what I want you to do. Everybody is supposed to get a lamb. Every family, every household is supposed to get a lamb. And you got to love God. He says, by the way, if you don't have a big enough family to eat a whole lamb, get together with your neighbors. Right? Probably, there's some exactly what a household is, we don't know, but probably is, if you've only got one kiddo thus far, get together with your neighbors so that you can eat this whole lamb. I mean, that sounds like a Yankee thing to do, doesn't it? Thrifty. If you can't eat the whole thing, we're going to get together until we find enough people to eat the whole thing. We occasionally get calls from the food shelf because somebody's given them some giant turkey, and they don't have anybody who can eat a giant turkey. Our family can eat a giant turkey. Maybe not in one sitting, but if it's 2 or 3, we'll do it, right? And then on the other hand, you have this fascinating thing that, by the way, if there's anything left over at the come morning time, you're supposed to completely burn it. Well, that's what it says. A truly thrifty person uses everything but the bleat, right? Use every bit of the lamb. Some of you grew up in families like that, right? You ate tongue sandwiches, and you know how delicious beef cheeks can be. Pickled pig's feet. The Israelites didn't eat a lot of those, but right? You know that you can use that for something. But God says no. If it's at the end of if it's leftovers, burn them completely. I know some of you will say, "Well, I often eat burned leftovers." So that's the only kind of food my mom makes. But God says, no. It's a complete burning. It's a burn it as a way of saying that it's done. There's this tension because on one hand, God is providing and wants them to share and have this. And then on the other hand, there's this idea of sort of worshipful wastefulness. I know some of you are getting, we don't waste food, right? It's a sin to waste food. You ever hear that? Exactly. That's how a lot of us are raised. But there's a certain act of worship that God is describing in being wasteful. It's this same thing saying, I have provided for you so fully that you don't have to scrimp and save. You ever, maybe you get a promotion or come into some money or something, and to celebrate it, you go out and you go to a restaurant and spend a little bit more money than you normally would. Right? My kiddos, we went to a restaurant once, and they said, this is a nice restaurant. When are you going to take us to Solo? The James Beard nominee restaurant over there in South Londonderry. Man and I went once. You had to bring a wheelbarrow full of money to go. We went once. It was delicious. We keep talking about it. The kids have heard it. I said, when everybody's 20, I'll take it. So we put it on the calendar because I'm not taking them to a fancy restaurant and have them order for plain pasta with cheese. Some of you remember peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I don't like octopus. Anyway, that idea about you get some money and you want to celebrate the fact that God has blessed you, and so you're a little bit wasteful. You're celebrating God's provision. There's a fantastic movie that I don't often recommend movies, Babette's Feast. It's a little bit older. I don't know if it's on Netflix or Amazon or something. Babette's Feast. This woman wins the lottery, and so to show not the modern lottery. I forget how old it is. Anyway, to celebrate, she buys all this decadent food to celebrate. It's fantastic. It may be subtitled, but there's not a lot of language in it. It's mostly pictures of food. It's lovely. Everybody understands that. It looks delicious. Anyway, that's what God's saying here is listen, I'm going to provide for you, and I want you to celebrate it, and I want you to share it with somebody else. If you don't have enough people to eat, but if there's anything left over, burn it. Don't try to eke out your own thing. Don't try to make a soup from it. And sometimes the leftovers, they keep being left over because there's a reason they were left over in the first place, right? He says, don't try to do that. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to move in a miraculous way in your life. I'm going to bring you out of Egypt, and so you don't have to live like slaves anymore. So you can be a little bit wasteful, you can be a little bit silly because you don't have to be thinking about the next day, because I'm going to take care of you. And we know from the rest of the Bible story that the rest of these people's lives, the Israelites that God brings out, the 600,000 men, probably somewhere around 2 or 3 million people total. The rest of their lives, God's going to provide for their food every day. He's going to send them manna, He's going to send them quail. They're going to complain about it. They're going to kvetch, but He takes care of them forever, and they die. And He takes a little bird, little thing on its head, like a partridge. Anyway, He takes care of them. And so that's one of the things that we see in this text, is this contrast between God's provisions and taking it and sharing it, and also worshipful wastefulness. Look at this building we're in. We could have been in a building with an 8-foot ceiling, right? Doesn't need these pretty fancy windows. Doesn't need these fancy pews. We could all be sitting on milk crates. There's a worshipful wastefulness. We said, this thing that God has done in our lives is so fantastic, we want to make it fancy. We want to make it special. We want to make it distinct. And so we see that in this text. For this is the text, this is the story, this is the event that Jesus will be looking back on, that Jesus is building upon when He meets with His disciples. This is the feast that they're celebrating when He meets with His disciples for that last time in the upper room. And so these ideas are what's resonating in their minds when God does something new. And we see this in the next juxtaposition, the next contrast, the next set of these ideas that are put next to each other in order for us to examine them. This is the comparison between bread and blood. Did you notice that? There are two things that happen in this text. Two descriptions of celebrations. One of them is the Passover. Slaughter the lamb, roast it, head, organs, feet, everything's supposed to be cooked over fire, not boiled. Again, no Yankee boiled supper. It's got to be cooked over fire, barbecue style. You got to eat it. And you're supposed to take, when you slaughter it, and you take the blood, you're supposed to eat it the same day. You take the blood, you use hyssop, the paintbrush of the ancient world. You dip it in the blood, and you smear some on the doorposts and on the top and the sides. And the angel of death, the destroyer, will come through and will see the blood and not go on it. This is the Passover of the Lord. And then you get this whole little description of, and by the way, you're supposed to spend 7 days eating bread without yeast in it. And then after you get that instruction, you get this little description that, and the reason why you are going to eat bread without yeast in it is that the people left Egypt before they had time to add the yeast to it. Again, like I said, there's some editing. Whoops, he was wearing a watch in that scene, and now he isn't wearing a watch. Little thing going on. You have this comparison between these two things, and as this plays out in the life of the people of God, we see this tension, these two ideas playing back and forth. On one hand, you have sacrifice, right? You have the lamb that's being slaughtered. God hasn't established His tabernacle and the law and the Levites and priests and all the sacrificial system that's going to happen. But you get just a little taste, no pun, of what's going to come before. He's building on some of the other sacrificial actions that have happened with God interacting with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob and with Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah. The way that God has used this concept of animal sacrifice and elevated it from its pagan understandings to some connection between this world and the spiritual. You see that in this text, but you also see this thing about eating this unleavened bread, this way of living your life for a whole period of time. You see it with the calendar. What we would understand later on is becomes the way of walking, the halakha of Judaism is hinted at this. These two things, the bread and the blood, they also speak to us about another division that we will see later on in the Bible, this division between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Remember, the Sadducees are focused on the temple. What goes on there? Who's collecting the money? Who's doing what? Who's the high priest? And the Pharisees, they're focused on the synagogue. They're spread all over the world. It's not just about who's in Jerusalem, but it's how you're living your life when you're living in Rome or in Athens or in Cairo. Not Cairo. What's why can't I think of it? Anyway, where's the big lighthouse in Egypt there? Alexandria. Anyway, don't come to me. How you're living your life in all these places, the Pharisees are they're reading the Bible and they're trying to figure out what it looks like to be a faithful person of God in your daily life. Because the Sadducees have screwed up the temple. I mean, they're pagans almost. I got that big eagle up on top and their kickbacks to Rome. And so what does it mean to be a godly person if you can't do the stuff you're supposed to do? See that tension there? There's a tension between what goes on in the temple and what goes on in your home. We know that, right? What's more important? What goes on in your church or what goes on in your home? Exactly. There's a tension though, right? And sometimes we emphasize one over the other. One to the detriment of the other. Or both are important. Having those be inconsistent causes all sorts of problems. We see, just as I talk about that, who's responsible for what goes on in the temple? Well, the priests and the Levites. Well, who's responsible for the families and what goes on in the temple? What is the instruction? Every male is supposed to take a sacrifice and make the sacrifice and take it. Well, who's controlling what bread gets baked and how much leavening goes into it and the rest of it? Well, who rules the house? Mamas rule the house. You see this tension between male and female spheres of influence and things. In this text, we get the layout and we see it play itself out throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament. When Jesus meets with his disciples and he takes that bread and he says, "This is my body." He's using sacrificial language. He's using Passover language. He's using lamb chopped up, blood splattered, to protect from the avenger. He's using that language to describe the bread. The unleavened, no yeast in it. He's unifying these ideas and these concepts into one thing. No longer do you have the Passover and the unleavened bread, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You have them two in one. Because Jesus is man and God in one. Jesus is the union that is so radically dissimilar. The union that we understand just a little bit by what St. Paul says happens when a man becomes united with a woman in marriage. That these two concepts come together, but we see them, the very root of them here playing out. Which leads us to the third thing we see, these two ideas. And it's in a place, it took me several times in reading this in order for it to click, because I kept struggling with that last little bit. Verse 43 to 49. The restrictions, my Bible has a subtitle. And these are, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, these are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it. Any slave you have bought may eat it, but after you have circumcised him. But a temporary resident or a hired worker may not eat it. It must not be eaten inside the house. None of the meat, none of the meat outside the house, do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. Listen to this. Any foreigner residing among you. Now, this sounds strange if it's being written to slaves, right? People who are living in the midst of slavery for 430 years. Right? The picture we get is the Israelites are living in their little ghetto community in Egypt. And that's where, that's the Israelite community. You can just imagine some Egyptian mother telling her son, now don't go down into Goshen because that's where all those Hebrews are. Right? Some of us get told, don't go to, this village, or don't go to this place or that street, or stay out of this section. That reads a little weird. Oh, any foreigners who are living among you who want to celebrate the Passover, they can't unless they're circumcised. That's what it says. All the males in their household must be circumcised. Then they may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. The same law applies to both the native born and the foreigner residing among you. There's something interesting there. This concept that somebody who's just living among you might want to eat this Passover meal. Or maybe you want them to eat it. Sometimes when God moves amazingly in our lives, we want that for somebody else. Right? We want to help them. We want to give that to them. That's the basis of social work, right? God has blessed us. We want to help somebody else. We want to bless them. That's why we give Christmas baskets, and we have the food bank, and we have the deacons fund, and we go and lend a hand to people because we want to help them. We'd like them to be able to experience God the way that we have. But there's a limit on that. There's a limit on how far that will take. You can redistribute goods and services. You can help people to the point where everybody's got the same. And I often say nobody should go hungry in America. We have so much food. We have so much wealth that everybody should have what they need. But you can't save somebody who doesn't want to be saved. You can't help somebody who doesn't want the help. The Israelites have to follow what God says. They've got to put the blood on the doorpost so that the avenger doesn't go in. And it's not some sort of magic charm. Right? You read it, you go, oh yeah, I know. If you just can imagine some Hollywood production of there's the angel of death coming, probably with a side or something, and the Hebrew has just dipped got late or something, and he's just dipped his hyssop in the blood and slides off it, gets one little drop of blood on the thing, like John Woo type style, and then the angel of death turns around. That's not how it works, right? It's not some magic trick. Because that's what you get here with this description too. It's not about some sort of magic charm that makes people enter into the covenant. He says they have to be circumcised. Now, I know some of you are going, well, wait a second, that seems like a magic trick. You do this particular thing and then therefore you're okay. But remember, God is taking something that has pagan roots, his roots outside the Bible, and he's elevating it, he's raising it. He says, no, this isn't just an outward circumcision, but it's an inward thing, it's an attitudinal thing as well. Now it starts, to be clear, it starts with the men, and it starts with physical circumcision, but this is what Jeremiah says, circumcise yourselves to the Lord, circumcise your hearts. Well, clearly he's talking about something a little bit different than says, oh, you do these particular things and you're okay. It isn't just the prophets, though, that have this idea of expanding beyond the law, or strict adherence to the law is what's required. Deuteronomy 10, I'm going to read a little chunk of it. Moses, or the author of Deuteronomy, it says this, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to Him, to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. Who does that sound? Sounds like Jesus when He's asked, what's the most important thing to do, Lord? To the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Yet the Lord set His affliction on your ancestors and loved them. I love that phrase. He set His afflictions on your ancestors and loved them. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be zealous and repent. Not a new concept. It's in Revelation. It's in Deuteronomy. And he chose you, their descendants, above all nations, as it is today. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. Did you notice when I read the section from Exodus, that little thing about and their gods? There's a battle going on in the Exodus. All those gods, all those statues that the Egyptians have, the weird gods with the animal heads and the human bodies and sticks and this and that, they're all worthless. They're all rocks and lumps of metal. The great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you praise. He is your God, who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. Your ancestors went down into Egypt, were 70 in all. And now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. That's the promise that God makes to Abraham. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the shore. To a guy who's 99 and has no kids, God makes that promise. And that promise we see fulfilled. We see it being hinted at in verse 49 of chapter 12 of Exodus. The same law applies to both the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. The same law. There is the possibility that people who are not Israelites can participate in this salvation. We see it hinted there, but we know it becomes a reality with Jesus Christ, with Jesus, the Messiah of God, coming and saying, "My body is broken for you." There's a new covenant that continues the old one. I'm making afresh and anew this covenant with you. The Apostle Paul will say it's a covenant that we enter into the same way that Abraham entered into his covenant. It wasn't by circumcising his flesh. It wasn't by adhering to a strict set of rules. It was by the heart change, the faith that Abraham exhibits that leads him to live a life that's changed. That leads him to live a life of faith. That leads him to follow where God leads. And that is how Abraham entered into that covenant, and that is how you and I have the possibility of entering into that covenant. It's the same law for those who are descendants of Israel or those who are grafted in afresh and anew. It's faith. And by that we then enter into this, and we have to have that faith. If we don't have it, we can't have a part of it. It doesn't make sense to us. We just are going through the motions. And you can force somebody to go through the motions. Sometimes people are forced into the motions of Christian living. They don't do this and they don't do that, and they do this and they do that. But it isn't in their hearts. Their hearts haven't been circumcised. Their hearts haven't been committed. Just their outwardness. So we read this text, this Exodus text. We read and we see how it plays out throughout the Bible. We see how it plays out in our lives now. Whether or not we remember the Exodus every year with a big meal, and we clean the house and make sure there's no yeast in it, and nobody takes the lamb anymore because the temple's gone. So whether we do that, or whether we embrace the way that it plays out through the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and we participate in that covenant of God, we participate in that salvation of God, we have to take it for ourselves, and other people have to take it for themselves and make it their own. Or else it just becomes something that they're doing, not something that's inside their hearts. Something that's done to them, not something that's their own, that's their faith.